All right, let's turn our attention to issues concerning the United Nations still. Now, the International Criminal Court has the obligation to prosecute individuals involved in international crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and offenses against administration of justice. Now, the ICC does not work in isolation. It works as a complement to existing national judicial systems, and it may therefore only exercise its jurisdiction when certain conditions are met, such as when national courts are unwilling or unable to prosecute criminals, or when the United Nations Security Council, or when individual states refer investigations to the court.
The ICC has four principal organs: the Presidency, the Judicial Divisions, the Office of the Prosecutor, and the Registry. The Office of the Prosecutor has opened 10 official investigations and is also conducting additional 9 preliminary examinations. So far, 39 individuals, all Africans, have been indicted in the ICC, including Ugandan rebel leader Joseph Kony, Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, and Ivorian President Laurent Gbagbo. Here are some other cases that have been and are still being prosecuted by the ICC.
All right, we also don't forget that the former president of Liberia, Charles Taylor, has also passed through the process there too. Now, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, 4 persons were indicted for crimes against humanity and war crimes between 2007 and 2012. Now, in Uganda, 5 persons were indicted for crimes against humanity and war crimes. Joseph Kony and Vincent Oti were regarded as fugitives, while Vincent Oti died in 2007. Now, Okot Odiambo and Raska Lukivia's proceedings ended as they died in 2006 and 2013, respectively.
In the Central African Republic, 5 persons were indicted for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and offenses against administration of justice between 2008 and 2014. In Sudan, 7 persons have been indicted for genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. 9 persons have been indicted for crimes against humanity and offenses against administration of justice in Kenya in 2011, including Deputy President William Ruto and Joshua Sang.
Now, 3 persons were indicted in Libya for crimes against humanity, including late President Muammar Gaddafi and his son. Now, in Ivory Coast, 3 persons were indicted for crimes against humanity between 2011 and 2012. 1 person was indicted in Mali for war crimes. He has been convicted and sentenced to 9 years in prison. All right, now we are joined by the coordinator of the humanitarian affairs at the UN office, Vincent Lele. Vincent, it's good to have you join us. Good morning and happy UN week, I must say.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right. Now, when it comes to ensuring peace and security across the world, we know that the issue of genocide, the issue of war crimes, the issue of crimes against humanity is very prominent. But African leaders have expressed their reservation for, especially even though the ICC is not directly a direct organ of the UN, but it's been working together with the UN. But if we see the reservation from African countries concerning how the ICC operates backed by the United Nations, what are your concerns, especially when some countries are threatened to pull out of treaties like that?
Thank you, sir, for this question. I would say that that question specifically relates to a very, very independent institution, the International ICC, and it has much less to do with the humanitarian function. However, I want to mention that each member state is a sovereign nation. Its sovereign decisions depend on how the citizens of that country and the leadership of that country decides. We in United Nations, which is a separate entity by itself also, have no comment on that actually.
All right, let's go to the one perhaps you might have a comment on. The war in Libya, a report came out a couple of months ago in the UK saying that the UK government acted in some urgency, that the report that Muammar Gaddafi was victimizing his victim was exaggerated. And you know that millions have died, millions have been displaced through the war. If that had happened to an African leader, perhaps in an African country, maybe that particular country will be under some kind of periscope as we speak. Why is the UK and the big wigs not under some kind of investigation based on this report?
There are humanitarian issues in Libya as a result of the violence, displacement, and the suffering of the population because of the ongoing violence that has continued over the last more than 3 years. The humanitarian community works together, and the UK is a member state that contributes to humanitarian priorities. I would like to comment that the international community has continued to prioritize the humanitarian needs that have resulted in Libya because of the violence and political instability, and a significant action has continued to be undertaken. And I would like to say that while there are gaps, whether of health, nutrition, food, and displacement protection issues, a lot of work is going on. Thank you.
All right, Vincent, let me take you to some of the agenda of the UN over the years. We had the Vision 2000, and after that we had the MDGs, and right now we have the SDG. Now, when it comes to fashioning out these agenda for a period of time, how would you say countries are inclusive, or they work in tandem together in fashioning out some of these agenda? Because some African countries, they just go adopt these things without considering the peculiarities of their countries, and then trying to have input into fashioning out, into crafting the idea of some of these agendas.
The social dimensions of development was a major milestone after the MDGs. And member states decided that the 17 goals will be entrenched by each member state depending on what they think is their priority. And each member state has actually done that, creating their own visions. We have many countries that have Vision 2030, Vision 2025. Others have gone even as far as 2050. Within each of those visions, each member state has prioritized critical actions within the SDGs, which means the countries have decided what comes first for them within the 17 goals. I would like to say Nigeria is on course. Nigeria is focusing on each of those priorities and is doing well in many of those areas, actually. One critical area, of course, is food insecurity and poverty, and a lot of work is being done, particularly in the Northeast, to combat the effects of violent extremism that has visited populations in that area, and many more areas that have had a few of the same issues. Nigeria is focused on those priorities.
All right, let's look about the Kampala Convention, which Nigeria is a signatory to, and look at the IDP situation there. Hundreds of thousands of children are malnourished, people are dying, they are not well catered for. Why is the UN not doing anything about
that? Kampala Convention is an Africa convention that was put in place in 2009 in Kampala, with the conviction that no person internally displaced will not enjoy the rights of their citizenship to that country. And it has critical pillars that Nigeria is following through. For example, in the northeastern Nigeria, particularly in Borno State, United Nations is working with the federal and state government of Borno in responding to the humanitarian needs of the population that has been severely affected by the Boko Haram conflict, and food, nutrition, water, protection services for children and women. These priorities are going on, and as soon as the stability is realized in that part of the country, more activities will be undertaken on rehabilitation and reconstruction and support to recovery of basic services like education, like water supplies, so that people can manage their lives the way they used to before the crisis came. And United Nations is playing a very, very critical role in support of Nigeria's efforts.
All right, Vincent, it's glad to know UN is playing a role, but make us understand, in what specific ways, what are those roles that the UN is playing? If we have to take the northeast of Nigeria as a focal point in here, what are the specific roles the UN is playing to assist Nigeria in getting out of the security situation and even restoring peace and even ensuring that the humanitarian crisis there is put behind the people?
The UN is accompanying the government of Nigeria on providing humanitarian assistance. Right now, we have teams working from Maiduguri. In the morning, like today, they have woken up, gone to work with the government officers. They have developed logistics and movements both on the ground and in the air to go and work in the IDP camps, to work in the host communities, populations that have continued to host internally displaced people. I was there last week myself, and I saw families that have almost nothing, but they have received people who have come from far with nothing, and they are staying in the same compound with them. They are giving them whatever little they have. And the government of Nigeria at federal and state level, Borno State in this case, with the support of UN and INGOs, are supporting families like those that I met. I would say that government of Nigeria at both state and federal level have formed committees. Today I will be attending one of those committee meetings where discussions and concrete action plans will be arrived at on what will be done each week going forward to ensure that no person is left behind from receiving assistance when they need assistance.
All right, it's still a UN week, and we still have with us in Abuja studio Vincent Lele, who is the head of the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Many thanks for staying with us still. Before we went on the news break, we were talking about the humanitarian crisis in the Nigeria's northeast. I'd like to talk about the pledges made by international communities to rebuild in the northeast. It has been determined about 90 billion naira is needed to rebuild the northeast, and substantially the international community has made some pledges. That is not forthcoming. From the report we have, just about 20% of those pledges had been realized, but that's not what is happening in some other parts of the world, like commitments made to Syria, for instance, refugees in Syria, for instance. Substantially, most of those pledges have been remitted. Why is that not the case in Nigeria?
Thank you so much for this very appropriate question. In Nigeria, the humanitarian appeal was for 484 million, and up until now, 183 million has been realized, meaning it's about 25%, a quarter of what was originally desired. These amounts of funds have gone into what I mentioned a little earlier, which is for nutrition of children, for health, for sanitation, for food, for protection of children from any abuse, for shelter, for all the essential services that enable people who have been displaced to live with dignity, so that citizens can enjoy a life that every one of us expects them to do. However, we would have expected to receive the $484 million. We still request the international community to consider prioritizing Nigeria. I know you mentioned Syria. The budget for Syria is much higher, and the percentage that they have received is not as much as they would have wanted. The amounts they require, if I recall, and I'm not sure if I'm correct now, was about $6 billion. they have not received 6 billion because the international community is struggling with crisis in several countries. Nigeria has its own northeastern region, Syria, Iraq, Somalia. Right now there is very big famine in Ethiopia and many, many other countries. Each of those countries requires significant amounts of funds, and the humanitarian community working with member states contributing resources that have enabled services and protection to be provided, but not adequate.
All right, Vincent, we'll come to you shortly, come back to you shortly. We have joining us now on Skype Dr. Sylvester Odion, the Department of Political Science, Lagos State University, joining us right now. Dr. Odion, it's good to have you join us, and happy UN week, if I have to put it that way. Now, a lot of Africans are concerned about the role African countries play in key decision-making in the United Nations. And they say that they don't have the same equal opportunity that others have, especially when you're narrowing it down to the issue of the Security Council, when no African country is among the permanent members of the Security Council. What is your take on this?
Well, I think that this is a permanent, struggle. If you recall that in 1945, in the 1940s, when the UN was being conceptualized, virtually all African countries were being colonized. They were under colonization. So they did not have a voice, they did not have a say. And so what we have seen is the trend in which the P5, have dominated decision-making in the United Nations over time. But the real point to make is that what have Africans done, even with their voice vote within the United Nations structures? Look at the case of Libya. They did not even abstain from the voting on the attack on Libya. And so they have played more or less reactionary role within the United Nations, rather than being supportive of African countries maintaining African solidarity on issues that have to do with sovereignty, and independence of African countries.
Okay, where do you draw the line between mediation and interferences when it comes to some of these wars that have been prosecuted in the world? Libya, for instance, Iraq, for instance, are staying in a very, where do you draw the line?
When you talk about drawing the line, don't forget that international politics has to do with hardware politics, interest of countries and nations. And so you ask yourself, what is our interest as Africans? The decision to invade Libya, the decision to invade, Iraq, was not done in the interest of the world. After all, most of the evidence that were, masked to justify the invasion of Iraq has been proven to be a big lie. And so you must know that there is always a subtext to actions that are taken internationally. And countries should sit back, or regional blocs should sit back and say, what is my interest? And that is it. So the P5 have always had their way in much of the issues, that we have on the platform of international politics.
All right, when it comes to the impact of the UN across the world, certainly a lot of people will say, well, they see the impact here and there. But if we have to pitch that against the success of the UN in relation to what it was originally formed to achieve, what's the pass mark you will give the UN when it comes to ensuring peace and security, which was one of the major reasons why the UN was formed?
We have to give credit when it's due. The point cannot be denied that UN has played a lot of role in mainstreaming peacekeeping activities globally, irrespective of the fact that the UN itself did not engender those conflicts. Those conflicts were engendered either by member states or the P5 in their usual power play. And that is it. But the UN has tried very well. In Africa, there are so many peacekeeping missions which the UN has initiated. And we must give credit to them. But above all, the point to make is that the UN gives countries, smaller countries of the world, what we call juridical sovereignty. The fact that they are recognized as nations, and they maintain what we call equality of states. And that is one of the things that the UN has done. So that even when powerful nations invade smaller countries, there's already a moral burden, because the UN says all countries are equal. And so you have that juridical sovereignty, which the UN has managed to guarantee.
All right, Vincent, let's come to you now. We know that your turf is that of humanitarian area. So let's link all this, the wars going around and the issue of humanitarian crisis in some of those wars vis-a-vis the peacekeepers, and how sexual abuse are going on in some of those fronts. South Sudan, for instance, it's been reported that girls are abused by the peacekeeper, UN peacekeepers. And in Central African Republic, there was also reports of UN peacekeepers abusing these children, even perhaps exchange for money. In Nigerian IDP camps, there were also allegations of some of these people exchanging sex for food. What do you make of that, and what is the UN doing about that?
Thank you very much for this very, very, very important question. The UN has taken very, very decisive actions wherever incidences have been reported. I recall, for example, in Congo, where there was a report on rape, which included in some instances UN staff. Very, very strong actions were taken. The culprits were apprehended, and each of them were taken through the courts of law. UN is not in isolation from the community where people are, and we are very, very vigilant all the time, including here in Nigeria, to make sure that people who are suffering, women and girls who have gone through trauma and abuse, who have suffered unexplainable situations, do not again go through situations under the hands of those who are supposed to be protecting them and consoling them. And I would want to confirm that we are working with the government of Nigeria at all times. We are extremely vigilant, and whenever an incident happens, swift actions are taken immediately. I can confirm that we have not yet had any incidents, although there are all sorts of seeping messages that people who are suffering are being abused again. We do not yet have evidence that is concrete for us to work with the government in following it up. Thank you.
All right, let me come to Dr. Dion here. You mentioned earlier that the UN says all nations are equal. But if we have to break it down to the practical operation of these, how equal really would you say nations are when it comes to approaches to economic indices, when it comes to political interface between each other and even the regional blocks and so on?
Well, I think that probably you didn't get my meaning very well.
Okay.
That's what we would call, equality within differentiation. And that was why I used the word juridical, sovereignty, which is legal because the UN says so. But of course, powerful nations have violated even the sovereignty of countries. And we do know that the global arena is underlined by a great deal of inequality. You have the rich countries of the global north, you have the poor countries of the global south. So those disparities are within, and nobody is denying that fact. But the fact is that the UN is a forum for bargaining, reconciliation, and what have you. And these of course are the merits, of that organization, of the global organization called United Nations. And it's also an arena for struggle. And that is why Africans are talking about having a permanent seat in the Security Council and all of that. But there's even a more global, aspect of the struggle, which is that there has to be what we call cosmopolitan democracy, mainstreamed into institutions of global governance, such as the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, and all those decisive, agencies of global governance that we have currently in place.
All right, we'll take some information and we'll get back to our guest. Let's take a look at some United Nations agencies that have been serving the Nigerian people, really. We'll start off with the World Health Organization. After recording more than 2 years a polio-free record, Nigeria continues to collaborate with the World Health Organization and other partners of the Global Polio Eradication Initiative to respond urgently and prevent more children from being paralyzed, even as the Nigerian government announced an outbreak in Borno State August this year.
Now, other areas the WHO has helped include the fight against malaria. Now, another key agency is the Food and Agricultural Agency, the FAO. And in spite of the oil, agriculture remains the base of the Nigerian economy, providing the main source of livelihood for most Nigerians and contributing the most to Nigeria's GDP. Now, this is the sector where the FAO functions.
In 2014, the FAO said it will focus on 5 strategic objectives anchored on the agency's global corporate strategic framework. The first objective was contributing to the eradication of hunger, food security, and malnutrition. UNICEF supports government's efforts to ensure that children survive, grow, and realize their full potential. UNICEF specifically aims to reduce maternal, neonatal, infant, and under 5 morbidity mortality.
Now, though maternal mortality rate in Nigeria has fallen, the overall number of maternal deaths remain high. Contraceptive prevalence is low and teenage pregnancy high. Now, United Nations Population Fund, the UNFPA programs focus on improving maternal and newborn health and providing access to sexual and reproductive health care for young people. Now, other UN agencies are UNESCO, International Labour Organization, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, and the list go on.
And UNIDO, we have UNIDO that takes care of industry. And now, let's go to Vincent and the issue of polio. Vincent, are you there? The Nigerian government, of course, there was a re-emergence of polio.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, there was a re-emergence of polio at the IDP camps or the areas where the war has been ravaged in the northeast part of the country. Efforts are being made. My question is, do you think right now the polio has been stemmed, the tide has been stemmed, or has it been kicked out completely from that area?
Thank you so much. I would say that the reemergence of polio is an indicator that the health situation of children in the affected areas by conflict is very, very dire. It is not just polio. It is all the other child diseases that need combating. And we are working with the government of Nigeria at all levels to remedy all the children diseases. And the WHO is leading with UNICEF in support of the Ministry of Health and the federal, the state level health institutions. We have worked together in support of the government plan in vaccinating very, very many children in those areas where the incident of polio happened, but also widening the reach to make sure that any possibility that polio could still be in some areas within Nigeria is taken note of, in addition to the vaccination for all other children diseases.
All right, Vincent Lele, UN Officer for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Thank you very much for talking to us on TVC Breakfast.
Sylvester.
All right, we still have Dr. Sylvester Odion joining us on Skype in there. Now, Dr. Odion, even though we're winding down now, but let me ask you this. Now, moving forward, one thing that is on the table of all countries from the United Nations is the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. If we have to narrow it down to the specifics, what do you think should be done so that the SDGs will be achieved higher than the way MDGs were achieved at the level to which they were achieved?
I think one point to make is that first, countries have to be committed, to the so-called Sustainable Development Goals, because it's just a transition from MDG to so-called SDG, and because we have not achieved much of the goals, spelled out in MDG, so we are talking about Sustainable Development Goals. So what is required is the commitment of all countries of the world. And the rich countries of the global north must invest in the sustainability of these goals.
All right. One of the goals of the SDG has to do with the climate change, which is a threat right now. You know that there was an agreement signed in Paris not too long ago, and Nigeria signed that particular agreement. But just recently, the nitty-gritty of the agreement is that you have to reduce carbon emission, no use of coal and all that. And just recently, Nigeria's Minister for Finance turned around and said, okay, we have signed this agreement now. We can't use coal to power our electricity, but we need an alternative source of power. That it is hypocritical of the developing world because they started that way. What do you make of that?
Well, I share your view on this because you see, if you look at industrialization, particularly going back to Britain where the Industrial Revolution set off, these energy sources was basically what they employed, you know, to unleash industrial revolution in their country. We've seen also China has also employed the same process. Now Africa is in the backwater of industrialization, and we are being told that we can't go through that same process. We are being, of course, cashed into, you know, signing protocols and agreements that will not allow us to exploit those resources that we already have in abundance. In terms of carbon emission, you know that the continent does not contribute something substantial to the global, you know, emission rate. And so, if you ask me, our country must exploit the resources we have to achieve a certain level of industrialization than to jump into what the post-industrial societies are doing.
All right, Dr. Sylvester Odion, thank you very much for talking to us on TVC Breakfast.
Thank you.
Thank you.